I never expected my life to bend in this direction. If you told me a year ago that I'd be sitting on the edge of my own bed, running my fingers nervously over a piece of silk my wife had just placed in my hands, I would have laughed you out of the room. It would have sounded like a description of someone else's life entirely, not mine. And yet there I was, hands trembling slightly, the fabric pooled in my lap, undeniably real. It began, as most unexpected things do, looking like a joke. My wife, Naomi, has always carried a mix of warmth and mischief that somehow makes you feel completely safe while also making you wonder what she's quietly plotting. It's one of the reasons I married her. What I didn't anticipate was that an ordinary Thursday dinner would end up rerouting the rest of my life. We were at the kitchen table, plates mostly empty, the evening unremarkable until it wasn't. Naomi had been quiet for a few minutes, glancing at her phone with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then she set it down and looked at me directly. "I think we should try something new around here," she said, and there was a spark in her eyes that immediately put me on alert. I laughed it off and asked what she meant. That was my mistake. Naomi's something new is rarely small. She folded her hands on the table and told me, with total calm, that she wanted me to start wearing feminine underthings around the house sometimes, whenever she asked. I nearly inhaled my water. I waited for the punchline. It didn't come. She wasn't joking, and the steadiness in her voice made that unmistakable. Heat crawled up my neck. Confusion, embarrassment, a strange flicker of curiosity, all arriving at once. I asked if she was serious. "Completely," she said, and then she explained herself. Not as a joke, not as a kink for its own sake, but as an exercise in trust. She wanted to see me let go of the version of myself I'd built out of habit and convenience. She wanted to know what was underneath it. I didn't know what to make of that. My whole adult life had been jeans, work shirts, practical decisions made, without a second thought. This felt like being handed a map to a country I hadn't known existed. Underneath the discomfort, though, was something else. A pull I didn't want to examine too closely. The first week was rough. Every time Naomi brought it up, my stomach folded in on itself. She never pushed. She just stayed gently, consistently present, telling me there was no timeline, no requirement to enjoy any of it right away. Eventually, I agreed to try. The first time I actually put on what she'd picked out, I felt absurd. Standing in front of our bedroom mirror, I barely recognized the person looking back, arms too stiff, shoulders hunched with self-consciousness. Every strap and seam suddenly the most important detail in the room. And then, without warning, something shifted. I stopped cataloging how ridiculous I felt and noticed, instead, how the fabric actually felt. Cool, soft, entirely unlike anything I normally wore. It wasn't a revelation. It was smaller than that. A flicker. But it was there. Naomi never laughed, never teased. She adjusted straps, suggested alternatives, reminded me there was no wrong way to feel about any of it. Slowly, the knot in my stomach loosened its grip, and something else moved into the space it left behind. Trust. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to. The difference between one fabric and another against skin, how certain colors seemed to shift my mood, the strange confidence that came from doing something unfamiliar and surviving it. Some nights I wanted to quit completely, staring at the drawer where everything was kept and wondering why I was putting myself through it. Naomi would sit beside me on those nights, take my hand, and remind me that nothing worth learning happens inside your comfort zone. Bit by bit, the uncomfortable experiment became something else, a slow education in vulnerability. Not because she demanded it, but because her certainty in me was steadier than my own doubt. I started a journal to keep my thoughts from spiraling. At first, it was just a record of awkward moments. Over time, it filled with something closer to an honest account of myself. Fears, small victories, questions I couldn't say out loud yet. Writing it down helped me untangle what I was actually feeling from what I assumed I should be feeling. The changes crept in quietly. Nothing anyone else would notice. But I felt them in how I stood, how I moved, a new awareness of the space I occupied that I'd never had before. Then Naomi asked for something that terrified me more than anything up to that point, to take one small piece of this outside our front door. Panic arrived instantly. Everything so far had happened behind a locked bedroom door, insulated from anyone's opinion but hers. The idea of carrying even a trace of it into the world made my mind spin through every worst-case scenario it could invent. She stayed calm. "It's not dramatic," she said. "Just a short walk. No one will know except us. And I'll be right there." That evening I stepped outside more nervous than I'd been in years. Every sound felt amplified. Every stranger's glance felt like a searchlight. My instincts screamed to turn back. But Naomi's hand stayed light and steady on my arm, and I kept walking. With every step, the fear didn't vanish, but something else arrived alongside it. Something close to freedom. Looking back, that walk was the actual beginning of everything. Not the clothes. Not the arrangement Naomi had proposed at the dinner table. The real beginning was letting myself be seen in a state of uncertainty instead of hiding behind the person I'd always presented as finished and sure of himself. The unfolding that followed wasn't a single dramatic turn. It was daily, incremental, sometimes exhausting. Naomi kept a drawer stocked, soft fabrics, unfamiliar colors, textures I wouldn't have chosen for myself in 100 years. Some mornings I'd stand in front of it for a full minute without touching anything. It felt less like clothing and more like a series of small dares. Some days I met the dare. Other days I found an excuse: work, exhaustion, tomorrow. Naomi never once made me feel like the inconsistency mattered. She simply reminded me, again and again, that this wasn't a race. One evening, wrung out after a brutal day at the office, I dropped onto the couch, completely spent. Naomi sat beside me, quiet for a moment, then reached for something she'd set aside earlier. My stomach tightened on instinct. "Not tonight," I said before she could even finish explaining. "I don't have it in me." She didn't argue. She just took my hand, warm and unhurried, and looked at me with a kind of quiet faith that made resistance feel pointless. She acknowledged how hard it was and pointed out, gently, not smugly, that the hardest nights usually taught the most. Something in her tone made argument feel unnecessary, and somehow I found myself listening instead of retreating. I changed reluctantly, fabric cool and strange against my skin. In the mirror, my reflection looked surreal, recognizable and foreign at once. I studied it slowly, waiting for the disgust I expected. It didn't come. What came instead was something closer to unsettled curiosity, not shame, but the first sense of potential. Naomi came up behind me, rested her hands on my shoulders, and told me quietly that I looked lovely. The words landed somewhere between terrifying and comforting. I felt exposed, yes, but also seen in a way I'd never quite let myself be before. The change wasn't only in the clothing. It showed up in how I held my shoulders, how I moved through our apartment, the small adjustments that felt like they were slowly loosening a version of myself I'd always believed had to stay rigid and controlled. Some nights, I cried out of pure frustration at my own clumsiness with all of it. Other nights I laughed, genuinely, at how strange the whole experience was. Naomi stayed constant through all of it, patient, present, reminding me this wasn't a contest against myself. The first real test of public vulnerability came when Naomi suggested a quiet cafe near our building, just coffee, nothing more. With one simple undergarment worn beneath my coat. My chest tightened at the idea immediately, my brain conjuring an entire gallery of imagined stares. But she took my hand as we left the apartment, and her presence kept me tethered to the ground. We found a corner table. I tried to focus on the coffee, on the low hum of conversation around us, anything but the spiral in my own head. People did glance over occasionally, but not with judgment. Most were absorbed in their own lives entirely. A couple of small, unremarkable smiles came my way, and somehow those tiny gestures made the world feel less dangerous than I'd built it up to be. After that day, something in me recalibrated. The fear didn't disappear. It just stopped being a jailer and became more like a familiar companion. I started to understand that this had never really been about the garments themselves. It was about learning to tolerate exposure, to hold discomfort without collapsing under it. Some mornings I still panicked at the mirror. Some evenings I lingered at the drawer, hesitant but curious instead of dreading. And Naomi stayed steady through it all, never rushing, never demanding, just present. Our conversations began to shift too. What used to be small talk about schedules and errands became something deeper: identity, trust, the pressure I'd carried for years to look composed and unshakable at all times. Naomi listened without flinching, and in turn I started noticing things about her I hadn't slowed down enough to see before: her patience, her instinct for the person underneath the fear. The real transformation, I realized eventually, wasn't happening to my wardrobe. It was happening between the two of us. One evening, drained from another long day, I walked in to find Naomi holding something new, a pale lilac garment with delicate stitching along the edge. My stomach dropped on instinct. Every reflex told me to dodge the moment, to retreat into old routines. But I thought about everything that had already happened: the first shaky attempts in front of the mirror, the walk outside, the cafe, and I reached out and took it instead of deflecting. That small motion taught me something. Growth rarely shows up as a single dramatic leap. More often it's repetition, showing up again despite the discomfort, taking one more step when everything in you wants to stop. Later, in front of the mirror, the lilac fabric felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. I studied my reflection and noticed, quietly, that the person looking back no longer felt like a total stranger. Uncertainty was still there, but so was something new: curiosity, the outline of a future where fear wasn't running every decision. Vulnerability and strength, I was starting to understand, weren't opposites. They could sit in the same room. By the second week, the shifts became harder to dismiss: not physical, something underneath. I spoke more openly. I worried less about appearing flawless. I admitted uncertainty instead of masking it. What had started as an odd challenge had become something closer to a mirror, showing me pieces of myself I'd never bothered to examine. By the third week, it had leaked out of our private moments entirely. One morning, still half asleep, I opened the drawer out of habit and paused. The dread that usually greeted me there had thinned. In its place, unexpectedly, anticipation. Naomi noticed before I said anything.
She always did.
"You've come a long way," she said. Feeling unusually sure of myself, I tried something I'd avoided until then: a full, coordinated outfit. Nothing extravagant, just entirely outside anything I'd have chosen a month earlier. In the mirror, the reflection still felt unfamiliar in places, but it no longer felt frightening. There was a kind of sincerity to it I couldn't quite name. And that, of course, was exactly when life decided to test me again. That same afternoon, I had a work meeting I couldn't avoid, the first real obligation that pulled me out of the house since any of this had started. Getting ready, every movement felt amplified. What if someone noticed something different? What if a colleague asked a question I couldn't answer smoothly? What if the confidence I'd been slowly building simply evaporated the second I walked into a fluorescent-lit conference room? By the time I reached my car, my pulse was hammering. I gripped the steering wheel like it might steady something. The drive felt endless. Every red light another opportunity to turn around, another excuse to bail. I kept going anyway. When I got there, nothing happened. The office looked exactly the same as always. People moved through their routines, exchanged the usual greetings, focused entirely on their own work. The world hadn't shifted at all.
Only my perception of it had.
Anxiety lingered anyway. Every conversation felt like a small exam. Every glance from a coworker sent a flicker of nerves through me. But each time, the feeling passed without incident. No confrontation. No ridicule. Just ordinary people doing ordinary things. By the end of the day, a realization had settled in quietly. The biggest obstacle had never really been other people. It had been the expectations I'd spent years protecting without ever questioning them. The real battle was internal, not external. That night, Naomi handed me tea and sat beside me on the couch. "You did it," she said. No fanfare, just quiet acknowledgement. I felt something I hadn't expected. Genuine pride, not because I'd done anything extraordinary, but because I'd chosen to walk toward the discomfort instead of away from it. As the weeks went on, it became clear this had very little to do with appearance and everything to do with authenticity. the slow dismantling of assumptions I'd never thought to challenge before. The next test came when Naomi suggested inviting a couple of close friends over for a casual evening. My old fears reignited instantly.
Part of me wanted to cancel outright.
But another part, the part that had already survived a walk outside, a cafe, a work meeting, remembered that fear's predictions and reality rarely lined up. I agreed after several days of hedging. The night before, I stood alone in front of the mirror, still catching flickers of unfamiliarity, but seeing something else too, evidence of growth, of a willingness to meet old fears head-on instead of folding. The gathering itself unfolded far more gently than I'd braced for. Our friends arrived, conversation flowed easily, people laughed, and the evenings simply continued the way ordinary evenings do. No dramatic reactions, no interrogation, just connection. A few times I caught my reflection in the window and felt a flicker of self-consciousness, but each time, it passed faster than the time before. I was starting to understand that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was openness, and openness was what let real connection happen at all. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt fully present instead of quietly. Managing appearances. It wasn't a clean arc, of course. There were setbacks, nights of doubt that returned uninvited, evenings where confidence felt like something that belonged to someone else. Through every dip, Naomi stayed steady. She never asked for perfection. "You don't have to become anyone else," she told me once. "You just have to be honest about who you already are." That sentence became something I returned to whenever the ground felt unstable. By the fourth week, though, growth reminded me it never moves in a straight line. Naomi raised the idea of a small family gathering, one where I'd carry the progress I'd built into a room full of people who'd known me for years, people who carried old expectations and older memories of who I'd always been. Strangers had been manageable. Family felt like a different order of exposure entirely. Sitting on the edge of our bed, I admitted I wasn't sure I could do it. Naomi took my hands. "You don't have to be fearless," she said. "You only have to be honest." The simplicity of it settled something in me. The fear stayed, but it stopped feeling impossible. The day arrived. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual before we left, uncertainty and determination sitting side by side in the reflection. Naomi rested a hand on my shoulder. "You've already done the hard part," she said, and for once, I nearly believed her. The drive was quiet, my mind filling the silence with imagined disasters that never actually happened. Then we walked through the door, and the world, again simply,
continued.
People greeted us. Conversation carried on. There was curiosity and a few glances, sure, but not the judgment I'd spent the drive rehearsing. By the end of the night, I understood something clearly. The greatest obstacle had never been other people's reactions. It had been the stories I'd built about those reactions inside my own head, weeks of fighting possibilities that existed nowhere but there. Driving home, exhausted but oddly lighter, Naomi smiled at me. "You did it." This time I believed her without hesitation, not because the evening had gone perfectly, but because I'd shown up despite being afraid. Progress, I learned in the days that followed, doesn't erase doubt permanently. Some mornings the old uncertainty resurfaced without warning, but I'd stopped treating those mornings as failures. Growth, I was slowly understanding, includes the setbacks. Self-discovery isn't a clean line. It's often messy, contradictory, uncomfortable. Naomi never treated the hard days as problems requiring solutions. She just reminded me that transformation takes time and nobody arrives at themselves in a straight shot. One quiet evening, sitting alone, I noticed how differently I was moving through ordinary moments. Making coffee wasn't something I rushed through anymore. Walking to the mailbox became a small chance to actually notice the world instead of just crossing it off a list. I was learning to let feelings exist instead of shoving them aside on principle. Around this time, Naomi introduced something new, not another garment, but an invitation to pay attention to how I carried myself.
Posture.
Gesture. The way I occupied a room. It felt awkward at first, every movement suddenly conscious and exaggerated simply from the act of noticing it. But over time the awkwardness thinned, and something more natural took its place. My shoulders relaxed. My guardedness eased. And the more comfortable I became physically, the more comfortable I became emotionally. The two things turned out to be more connected than I'd ever assumed. By the 5th week, the whole experience had stopped feeling like pretending and started feeling like simply part of my life. The framework Naomi had introduced no longer read as a set of rules. It had become something closer to an invitation, a standing permission to stay curious about myself instead of afraid. By the 6th week, my relationship with the whole process had changed shape. The anxiety hadn't vanished, but it no longer ran the show. Some days, I felt sure of myself. Other days, I didn't. Either way, I kept moving. Then came the next invitation, a small dinner at our apartment, a handful of close friends, nothing elaborate. Being seen by strangers had been one kind of difficult. Being seen by people who actually knew me felt far more personal. My first instinct was to retreat to something safer. But I thought back through everything that had gotten me here, the mirror, the walk, the cafe, the family gathering, and I said yes anyway. Getting ready that evening felt less like bracing for an ordeal and more like an act of quiet confidence. I chose something understated, nothing designed to draw attention, just something that reflected who I was actually becoming. Standing in front of the mirror, I wasn't hunting for flaws. I was simply looking. Uncertainty was still present, but so was something steadier, resilience, and underneath it, honesty. Naomi appeared beside me. "You look ready," she said. For the first time in this whole process, I didn't need to argue with her. The dinner started with the usual nerves, racing heart, unsteady hands, every sound louder than it needed to be. But as the evening went on, the fear receded into background noise. Conversation moved easily. Stories were told. People weren't reacting to whatever I'd spent weeks imagining they'd notice. They were simply responding to me. My presence. My energy. The quiet confidence that had been building, one small risk at a time for weeks. For the first time, I felt entirely present. Not hiding. Not performing. Just there. After everyone left, Naomi and I sat together in the quiet apartment, the evening settling around us. Looking back over everything, I could see how much this had reshaped me, not because of the clothes themselves, but because it had forced me to face fear instead of managing around it. It had taught me to hold uncertainty without needing to resolve it immediately, to let vulnerability sit next to confidence instead of treating them as enemies. Doubt still visited sometimes, but it no longer carried the same weight. I understood now that growth is rarely tidy. It's often contradictory, occasionally exhausting, and that's simply part of what it is. Looking at the person I'd become since that first dinner table conversation, I could see the distance clearly. The hesitant person who used to avoid mirrors entirely had turned, slowly, into someone steadier, not finished, not without doubts, but growing. Maybe that's the actual definition of transformation, not becoming someone else, but becoming more completely the person who is already there. That last night, looking at my reflection one more time, I felt something I hadn't felt at the very start of all this. Peace. Not because every question had been answered, but because the questions themselves had stopped frightening me. The road ahead was still unmarked. For the first time, that felt less like a threat and more like an invitation. I had found resilience I didn't know I had. I had found a version of courage that didn't require certainty first. And most of all, I had learned that honesty with yourself is where everything else actually begins.